Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare, did not invent the first-person shooter. It was not the first or last Call of Duty to consist of a linear single-player campaign that supplies its weapons and locales for the multiplayer playground. It was, however, the first game of its type to truly commit to a modern setting. The geopolitical thriller of its narrative was nuclear in scale, but still managed to focus on a few very strong characters. This heavy-hitting story, paired with rewarding upgrade systems in the well-built multiplayer, managed to sell 7 million copies of Modern Warfare before the end of 2007. This seems to have caught the Medal of Honor franchise flat-footed in the midst of perfecting its now archaic depiction of the Second World War. After Modern Warfare's release, both that setting and the way those games were built suddenly felt more at home in 1999 than it did in 2007. Medal of Honor fell suspiciously silent after that year. When they returned in 2010, they did so with their own first foray into the modern setting. Danger Close and DICE had built something both similar and different to Infinity Ward's Modern Warfare, and they simply titled it Medal of Honor to make clear its status as a new beginning for the franchise. Both of these games showcase multiple perspectives of the various good guys involved in a contemporary conflict. Where Modern Warfare compares the surgical SAS with the hard-hitting U.S. Marine Corps, Medal of Honor contrasts the stealthy reconnaissance of SEALs and Delta with the up-front firepower of the Rangers. In Modern Warfare, you are put in control of an AC-130 gunship's weapons, experiencing firsthand the eerie detachment from the battlefield you nonetheless maintain godlike power over. Medal of Honor depicts the AC-130 from an external perspective, as a potent guardian angel able to support your efforts on the ground for the duration of the night. Modern Warfare makes good on its name when you rescue the female pilot of a downed Cobra. In Medal of Honor, you are instead dropped into the front seat of an Apache, engaging targets marked by your female-piloted companion aircraft. Perhaps the most important similarity between these two stories, though, is the death of a playable character. In both cases, this is experienced in first person, like the countless preceding unscripted deaths. The circumstances of these deaths, however, are illustrative of the biggest difference between the games. Modern Warfare is a globe-trotting epic of nuclear proportions. The overt fictionality of its narrative gives it extraordinary liberties in how it can present the actions of the good or bad guys, and allows it to conjure nuclear detonations or civil wars on a whim. The advantage, or perhaps disadvantage, of Medal of Honor's story is that it commits to representing a real conflict, a true modern war that was still ongoing while the game was being made and released. It is a fact of modern existence that semi-journalistic films will impatiently attempt to reframe the popular conception of events that have hardly transpired. When a game like 6 Days in Fallujah attempts a similar exercise, though, it becomes mired in controversy. Video games do wrangle with questions of morality in a way only they are capable of, but they do so largely behind the cloak of fiction. Real events must be interpreted by an established author or filmmaker. We are not trusted with those stories in an interactive medium. Medal of Honor escapes some, but not all, of that controversy by renaming everyone. This renaming, however, is not merely an effort to gain distance from real events. It is also used to simplify, streamline, and intimatize the narrative. For example, every time an AC-130 is called into action, it is our old friends Reaper 3-1, who really stand in for Grim 3-1, Grim 3-2, Nail 2-2, and so on. Timelines have been restructured, and units, having been condensed, are fewer in number, but these inaccuracies are narrative choices that focus and enhance the power of some very real themes. Through lengthy pre-mission cutscenes and rigidly linear environments, Medal of Honor focuses all of its efforts on telling a powerful and intimate story about comradeship, about trials by fire, and about the pitfalls of bureaucracy or of relying on new technologies. These are the exact same overall messages that you might draw from studying the literature on Operation Anaconda for 6 months, but Medal of Honor's narrative, despite or because of its intentional inaccuracies, gets you there in 6 hours.
Jimmy, Panther, things have changed. Looks like the enemy are in the mountains. There's a lot more of them.
Roger. Listen, Flag wants to send in the Rangers ahead of plan.
Not advisable. The reality has changed. Plus, Task Force Rebel is going in tonight.
That general's 9,000 miles away and he's calling an audible.
He doesn't want the Afghans. He wants our guys on the ground.
He needs to listen to the guys on the ground. It's find the bad guys, kill the bad guys. It doesn't work real well the other way around. Stall him.
Roger. I'll do what I can.
At least 2 of the consultants listed in the credits were on the ground for Operation Anaconda. Colonel Pete Blabber commanded the Special Forces reconnaissance mission leading into the battle, and Sean Naylor was an embedded journalist. His book, Not a Good Day to Die, is probably my preferred source on the subject, as it provides the most detail on the intelligence gathering, planning, and reconnaissance that preceded the main events of the operation. Also published in 2005 was Malcolm Macpherson's Robert's Ridge, which focuses on dramatic first-hand accounts of the battle on Takur Ghar. Later, in 2011, we got Operation Anaconda, which I regard as the first real history book on the subject. Lester Grau, an academic historian who had already written numerous books on the Soviet-Afghan War before 2001, and Dodge Billingsley, another embedded reporter, try to zoom out from the prior focus on Robert's Ridge. They provide valuable context for the situation in Afghanistan, and then explore the entirety of the coalition's effort, refusing to focus on the drama surrounding the American Special Forces. The operation revealed in these works is one of stunning political and logistical complexity. Afghanistan is a landlocked country with no railroads and few decent regular roads. This lack of infrastructure pairs with the rugged terrain to severely limit the size of force and type of equipment that can be deployed there. The Soviets struggled with this problem, and in 2001 and 2, the Americans were limited by the capacity of their strategic air bridge. All personnel, fuel, supplies, and equipment had to be carried into Bagram or Kandahar in the bellies of transport aircraft. There were political limitations as well. The Pentagon was nickel and diming every request for more troops and equipment in country. Hence, the complexity. Anaconda, the first battle in Afghanistan for America's conventional forces, was carried out with a piecemeal force, scrounged from what little was available. Naylor describes just how complicated it was, writing, quote, "For a battle that would involve perhaps 2,000 Allied troops, less than a brigade's worth in combat, CENTCOM had cobbled together a force that drew elements from 8 countries, 2 U.S. Army divisions, 2 Special Forces groups, a hodgepodge of aviation units, and a variety of clandestine organizations. Despite the enormous military skill and experience nested in most of these units, the operation's main effort was to be a few hundred Afghans drawn from different clans and provinces who had barely a month of semi-formal military training under their belt. The Air Assault Blocking Force mission was the responsibility of Task Force Rakhisan's 3 infantry battalions, one of which was from not just a different brigade than the others, but another division entirely, and each of which was missing one of its 3 rifle companies. Within Task Force Rakhisan, units had been pulled from companies and battalions and cross-attached to others to such an extent that from the rank of lieutenant colonel down to lieutenant, officers were working alongside and under commanders they had never trained with, and in some cases, barely knew. The job of lashing this Rube Goldberg organization into a cohesive fighting force fell to Hagenbeck and his downsized staff, almost a third of which consisted of complete newcomers to the 10th Mountain headquarters. The Mountain staff came up with a word for the organizing principle behind the force they were being asked to control. Adhocracy. End quote. Instead of recounting Operation Anaconda in all its maddening detail, Medal of Honor downsizes the story to such an extent that 4 perspectives are enough to fully explore it. Rabbit is one of 4 SEALs in a team called Neptune, which shows us some of the collaboration with native Afghan forces before standing in for Mako 3-1 in the Valley and Mako 3-0 on Takur Ghar. Likewise, their colleagues in Wolfpack, viewed through the eyes of Deuce, represent the Delta teams, Juliet and India. And yes, Juliet did use specially modified ATVs to get to their observation post. Names like Deuce, Dusty, Panther, Vegas, Rabbit, Mother, Voodoo, and Preacher are a reference to the code names or nicknames that these operators went by in the field, not all of which were quite so outlandish. Mako 30, for instance, consisted of Randy, Turbo, Brett, Kyle, Thor, Chappie, Fifi, and Slab. Conventional forces do not enjoy such anonymity.
Friendly! Friendly!
Preacher, blue!
Holy shit. We got you.
God damn it, where'd you army boys come from?
You didn't see that Chinook drop out of the sky?
We've been a little busy up here.
We're the QRF sent to get you guys. Our bird was hit. We've lost 3 men so far.
I'm Sergeant Patterson. This is Specialist Adams.
Voodoo. Preacher.
Command said there were 4 SEALs on this peak.
There are. We need to get the other 2.
The Rangers are seen from the perspective of Specialist Dante Adams. They stand in for the 101st Airborne and 10th Mountain Troops that air assaulted into the valley, but also act as themselves in the Battle of Takur Ghar. And finally, the Apache experience is provided by co-pilot gunner Brad Hawk Hawkins. All of these protagonists are silent. Throw in some token Afghan allies, some close air support assets, and one overworked AC-130, and you've got more than enough complexity for a 6-hour campaign. The 2 U.S. Army divisions, the Canadians, the Australians, and everyone else involved just don't exist. And the enemy has also been simplified because they were no less complicated. The failed state of Afghanistan harbored many factions that the Americans tried to ally with, fight against, or otherwise mispronounce. The enemy, moreover, was not homogeneous, instead forming its own multinational coalition, as Grau and Billingsley describe. Quote, "Other forces trained in Afghanistan but were not necessarily part of either Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. Uzbeks from the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan and Uyghur separatists from China's Xinjiang province had a sizable presence. The Egyptian Islamic Jihad and the Al-Ansar Islamic movement also maintained training camps in Afghanistan. Kurds from Turkey, Yemenis, Bangladeshis, Malaysians, Sudanese, Kenyans, Algerians, Filipino Moros, and African-American Muslims added to this international presence. Many of these people were training not to fight with the Taliban, but to fight in their own or in other foreign countries. By 2000, there were 14 separate jihadist groups training or working in Afghanistan." End quote. Of course, many of the enemy in the Shaikat did not survive to tell the tale, and the ones who did do not have the same habits of record-keeping and memoir writing as we do. As a result, the account of this battle will always be one-sided, at least in terms of the level of detail. From the soldier's perspective, the perspective Medal of Honor is experienced in, you don't really care where the enemy is from or what motivates him. Your primary concern is whether he is holding an AK or an RPG. There are, nonetheless, a few nods to the internationality of terrorism. Some of the enemy are referred to as Chechens, and someone is supplying them with G3s. While it is unlikely that this rifle was available in such quantities, it serves as a reminder of the 20th century roots of this 21st century story. Medal of Honor sets the stage by establishing the electromagnetic context for the war that is about to break out. In this century, advanced communications technology allows commanders to micromanage their forces from the far side of the world. Enemy communications can be aggregated into what is called signals intelligence, and real-time aerial surveillance and reconnaissance provides at least the illusion of omniscience. Recently, signals intelligence and drone strikes have proven their place in peer-to-peer conflicts of the 21st century, though we still associate them with insurgency wars where the enemy has little to no air defense. All of this, of course, is just a prologue for a more timeless, unchanging element of warfare. What really matters, or what makes everything else matter, are the boots on the ground. Signals intelligence only takes you so far. These SEALs are looking for good old-fashioned human intelligence, and driving through these dark streets instills a classic sense of mystery and foreboding. They are trying to determine the quantity and location of the enemy. Of course, to make things interesting, it turns out that they are right here, and there are a lot of them. Tariq, the asset rescued by the SEALs, answers their question more specifically by pointing to a valley in the distance.
Why should we trust you?
Please.
I have a daughter. I want her to go to school. I want her to be a person, have a life. Do you not understand?
Okay, I understand. Where are the enemy?
Shayakot.
Shaikat. What's that?
It's Pashto. It means Valley of the Kings. Shayakot.
Where is it?
There.
How many?
Many. 500 fighters. Or more.
There is little agreement on how to spell or pronounce Shayakot, as Grau and Billingsley exemplify when they describe the real version of Tariq's intel. Quote, Commander Zialodin, a Pashtun from Gardez, was unable to get spies and scouts into the Sheriko, but he did know that cooks from the city of Zermatt were preparing daily meals for 500 in the valley. End quote. Zialodin was the commander of the Afghan allies who, with the support of American Special Forces, would attempt to be the main effort of Operation Anaconda. Our experience of fighting alongside friendly Afghans, however, will come in the next mission, where we capture Bagram Air Base. Bagram was actually taken in a less contested fashion long before the intelligence about the Shayakot started coming in, but this fictionalized battle showcases some very real concepts. The rusting MiG-21s and T-55s are accurate, as are the war-torn buildings of the airfield, as Naylor would tell you. Quote, the first American troops into Bagram belonged to ODA 555, the Triple Nickel, who arrived with the Northern Alliance on October 21st. The Special Forces soldiers found the base in terrible condition. Bullets had pockmarked the low-quality concrete every building was made of. Here and there, a larger hole had been punched through a wall by a tank main gun round, or the corner of a roof ripped off by a rocket-propelled grenade. There was no electricity or running water. All that remained of the Afghan Air Force was a jumbled pile of broken and rusting MiGs beside the runway. End quote. The sequence at the end of this mission presents a gamified version of a crucial job in Operation Anaconda, that of a combat controller, a member of the Air Force fighting alongside ground troops with the equipment and expertise to coordinate with aircraft. Medal of Honor relies on air power for a lot of its shock and awe, and that, again, is a reflection of the operation it is based on. The enemy in the Shayakot did not have tanks, but they did have technicals, mortars, and artillery pieces. This actually gave them a firepower and mobility advantage over the 10th Mountain and 101st Airborne troops who air assaulted into the valley. The helicopters had reduced lift capacity due to the elevation, risked being shot down if they flew in the daytime, and became busy just trying to supply the forces already on the ground. This, combined with a lack of ground vehicles, meant the Americans' mobility was reduced to that of walking, with heavy loads over rough terrain at high altitude. The enemy, on the other hand, had access to a plenitude of trucks and SUVs. They also outgunned the Americans with ubiquitous 82mm mortars, Dushkas, RPGs, and a few 122mm howitzers. The Americans' first lift into the Shayakot had one 120mm mortar with 48 rounds. The rest of their heavy fire support would have to come from the sky. Air power is powerful, but it is also expensive, weather-dependent, and it lacks the suppressive capability of continuous artillery bombardment. In addition, it is usually locked behind additional layers of bureaucracy. Grau and Billingsley quote Lieutenant Colonel Chip Preisler's thoughts on this subject. Quote, "It is good to have air support, it is good to have mortar support, but it would be great to have some artillery. Weather does not shut down artillery or mortars. There is no such thing as constant close air support, but artillery is a constant, and it gives the enemy no forewarning, or no more than 2 seconds if he hears the shot fired. Mortars give the enemy plenty of warning. Aircraft come overhead and fly a big donut in the sky before they attack. This enemy learned very quickly to go to ground when the aircraft checked in or the mortar fired. The aircraft would drop bombs or leave, and as soon as the sky was clear or the mortar round exploded, the enemy would come back out shooting. Now at night, when the AC-130 was overhead, you could take your boots off and really get some sleep. That was fairly constant CAS, but only for a few hours." End quote. With infrared sensors, a 105mm howitzer, a 40mm Bofors, and two 20mm Vulcans, the AC-130H Spectre essentially constitutes a flying artillery battery with its own integrated spotting capability. In Medal of Honor, we experience the results of its omniscience and omnipotence at very close range. It is a good thing that Reaper 3-1 is on our side, and we are happy to stick our necks out for them when they stay too long into daylight. Of course, this shared experience makes what follows all the more painful.
Are you registering weapons?
Affirmative, sir.
Well, then that's a high-threat area with unidentified vehicles registering weapons.
Sir, we don't have positive ID on those
Reaper
vehicles.
3-1, you are cleared hot on those vehicles.
Father, this is Grau 01. We seem to be taking some fire. Do you have eyes on our grid? Incoming! Incoming! Father, we have been engaged! Request immediate assistance!
Right, ceasefire, those are friendlies.
Who is this?
This is Panther, you are engaging Kiev rebels.
Ceasefire! Ceasefire!
Shit! We've got casualties! Move them away, South Get out of the way! They're bugging out, sir. What? Where are they going? Shit! Anderson, Williams! Get the truck and bring it back!
Sir, we've lost Task Force Rebel. They're heading back to Gardez.
This friendly fire incident did actually happen, though its causes and effects were different than depicted here. Medal of Honor's version of warfare is always a bit too whitewashed and ennobling, and this is the closest it comes to showing the pathetic, the ugly, and the dark. Sean Naylor's book provides a more honest, more detailed, and more cringeworthy account. Quote, "The truck stopped moving as the other vehicles kept trying to outrun the murderous fire. Despite his wound, which was critical, Harriman got back on the radio and, with a weakening voice, requested support. On board Grim 3-1, the crew chatted in a businesslike fashion as they lined the targets up in their gun sights. They're unassing the area, said one crew member, as the troops in the convoy tried desperately to evade Grim 3-1's merciless pounding. That last one is trying to boogie, replied another. Scanners, keep your eyes peeled. The first one is stopped. Second one hit. Get out in front of that lead vehicle and lead him. Soon, all the vehicles in the little convoy had stopped, and anyone who could walk was taking cover behind rocks. Above them, Grim 3-1 had made 1.5 orbits of about a 2-kilometer radius. The crew had fired between 8 and 10 rounds and could see there were still targets left to engage, but they were at bingo fuel and dawn was coming, and so DJ pointed the aircraft north. 2 minutes and 13 seconds after the firing began, it was over." End quote. Harriman would be the only American to die on the first day of Operation Anaconda. Unlike the game's portrayal, though, this was an attack on a small element of Task Force Hammer rather than the main convoy, and while it did contribute to the Afghans leaving the fight, it was only one of many factors, including actual enemy fire and a lack of friendly air support that wasn't directed at them. In the game, this setback is somehow meant to justify the immediate deployment of the Rangers into the valley, even though in reality the 10th Mountain and 101st Airborne insertion had been meticulously planned for weeks in advance. The journey through fire undertaken by Patterson, Hernandez, Ybarra, and Adams represents the first contact between Al-Qaeda and conventional American ground forces. The reliance on air power is, again, apparent. Ybarra, as you may be able to tell from his different camo, is one of the enlisted tactical air controllers from the Air Force, and we will need him. The proximity of this Dishka gives rise to a need to suppress it while we mark it for an airstrike. Not only is this a perfect job for Adams and his squad automatic weapon, but it represents a side of warfare not often experienced in video games. Aimed fire at a visible human target is actually a rarity on the modern battlefield, and it usually indicates a stroke of luck on your part or a mistake on the enemy's. We would be surprised how much ammunition is expended in reconnaissance by fire, suppressive fire, and fire at targets that are only suspected to be such. Like many of the story elements in Medal of Honor, Adams's suppressive fusillade, though fictional, is representative of reality.
What's the BDA? Do you need another pass?
Noble 3-5, Bravo 1-6, Delta Hotel, target eliminated. Damn, I don't ever want to be that close again.
The potency of this supporting air power makes its subsequent absence more acutely felt, and that, in turn, enhances the joy of being rescued by Apaches. Both of those phenomena are, again, realistic. You may be detecting a pattern. Real occurrences and mechanics of the battlefield are used as plot points in a fictional narrative. That narrative reorders and intimatizes the events, forging them into a compelling story. Neptune and Wolfpack are involved in gathering intelligence on the enemy and then seizing Bagram Airfield. Reaper 3-1 helps out Neptune, and they in turn save Reaper 3-1, increasing familiarity and enhancing the pain of the subsequent friendly fire incident. The Rangers are saved by Apaches, who, at the end of their mission, are saved by a 50 caliber headshot from Wolfpack. Wolfpack continues sniping, helping Neptune fight off some enemies on a distant ridgeline, and when Neptune gets into trouble on Takur Ghar, both the Rangers and Reaper 3-1 re-emerge to help them. If the mission in the valley had been played as a soldier of the 10th Mountain, which would have been more historically correct, then we would have no familiarity with and no emotional stake in these Rangers. The same would be true if the previous reconnaissance missions were carried out by a team other than Neptune, as was also the case historically. On top of Takur Ghar, which, by the way, just means tall mountain, the timeline has again been restructured. However, refusing to leave comrades behind is still the central tenet of the engagement. Falling or jumping out of helicopters, helicopters getting shot up, the right side door gunner and 3 Rangers getting killed immediately. All of these things really happened, and so did the first use of a Predator drone in support of troops in contact. Positioning this as the climactic moment is a powerful narrative choice because the Predator buzzing overhead has been a recurring motif throughout this story, but it is also a conclusive historical statement about the 21st century nature of this warfare. This, it seems to say, is the future. At the moment of the rescue, we re-inhabit Rabbit's perspective, but things aren't looking so good. He fades in and out, surrounded by brothers in arms from 3 services. They are doing everything in their power to keep him alive and hasten his evacuation.
We have to wait. Birds are coming from Kandahar.
No. Jimmy, Voodoo.
What the fuck is going on? Rabbit is gonna die if we don't get off this fucking mountain now.
Almost there, brother. Almost there. Hang on.
Neptune 1, Prowler 4, on approach to LZ, grid 201889. Proceed with the sit rep regarding enemy disposition near LZ.
Prowler 4, Neptune 1. No enemy.
We're losing him.
LZ is ice.
Rabbit.
LZ is ice.
Rabbit.
That is about as noble as death gets, and it is a far cry from what actually happened to Petty Officer First Class Neil Roberts. He was wounded, captured, and executed long before any of his comrades returned for him. Rabbit's fate here more closely resembles that of pararescue jumper Jason Cunningham, one of the medics who came in with the Rangers. After arguably causing this whole situation by rushing the insertion of Mako 3-0, General Trebin chose the moment when the LZ was finally secure to decide that no more helicopters would be sent. Not until dark, at least. Naylor describes the result of this decision. Quote, "As darkness settled over the valley, Jason Cunningham began to slip away. Don held a pressure bandage to him for 45 minutes, during which time Cunningham pulled Don to him and whispered a last message to pass to his wife. For 30 minutes, LaFrenz and Miller did nothing but work frantically on the dying PJ, inserting a breathing tube and performing CPR. It was no use. Shedding bitter tears, LaFrenz walked over to Self at 6 p.m. You can tell them our KIA total is 7, he said angrily." End quote. Unlike the Clancy-esque Modern Warfare and the directionless Medal of Honor Warfighter, Medal of Honor does not have a primary, named Villain. The biggest killer of Americans during Anaconda, other than car crashes back stateside, was their own command structure, an organization that had been cobbled together at the last minute out of units that barely knew each other. Roberts, Chapman, Svitak, Anderson, Croce, Commons, and Cunningham were all killed by enemy bullets. But I would not be alone in opining that their real cause of death was bureaucracy. It would be easy to equate the fictional General Flagg with the real General Trebon. They do seem equally out of touch, but it is more complicated than that. Flagg represents the entire concept of bureaucracy rather than any particular bureaucrat. On numerous occasions in Operation Anaconda, bureaucracy, miscommunication, and a lack of unity of command brought about disaster despite every individual's best efforts to the contrary. Rather than try to explain all of that in cutscenes that are already too long, Medal of Honor symbolizes and contains that friction and mismanagement in its fictional antagonist, General Flagg. With a background of attractive secretaries and palm trees at his office 9,000 miles away, he is a caricature of everything that an on-the-ground soldier like Colonel Drucker hates about the cumbersome command structure above him.
Mobilize the QRF. We're getting our men back.
And risk losing another bird? Negative. We call in close air and then reassess our options once the enemy's been thinned out.
Now you want to reassess? Sir, they are sitting on top of a mountain with limited firepower at night, and Reaper 3-1 has orders to RTB before dawn. That's in 15 minutes.
And by the time the QRF gets there, it'll be broad daylight.
Sir, we are wasting time!
That's it, Colonel. You had your chance to square this away.
You seem to have lost the VTC, sir.
The protagonists, then, are the brothers-in-arms who are actually fighting on the ground. Rabbit is a martyr to their cause. Medal of Honor focuses everything it has on that story. The cutscenes are lengthy, and the missions are rigidly linear. There are no side objectives, missable sequences, or sequence breaks. Everything must happen in the correct order. It has brought modern history into the interactive medium, but it nevertheless maintains tight control of how that history is experienced. The game even goes so far as to make certain enemies invincible for a fraction of a second, until their narrative purpose is expended. The only real enemy variety is between AKs and RPGs, so there is very little spontaneity to the combat. All of the drama is scripted, and almost all of it is environmental. Coming out of the smoke here, for example, the environment is constructed in such a way that you end up looking at Reaper 3-1 just as it comes under attack. Fortunately, Medal of Honor usually still lets you choose where to look. The pre- and post-mission cutscenes are certainly overdone, but mid-mission cutscenes are a rarity. When they do occur, they are seamless and do not leave the perspective of the player character. The weapon mechanics are up to date for 2010, and the weapons themselves are accurately and beautifully modeled. Most importantly, for a multi-perspective first-person game, the weapons carry with them the identity of the character. Rabbit has his M4 with an ever-changing variety of attachments, usually a modernized M14 and a P226. He is a SEAL, after all. Deuce is more of a sniper. He carries an SR-25 and then an MP7 for close-in work. Every now and then, he also pulls out the Barrett. Adams, being less special than the other forces, is stuck with the standard-issue Army stuff. An M249, a Beretta, a Benelli, and a less tricked-out M4. You can pick up enemy weapons, but to me this violates the identity of each character. Soldiers in the Shiakot did engage enemies with M4s, M249s, SR-25s, and so on. They did suppress enemy positions and mark them for airstrikes. In Medal of Honor, ranges are compressed and enemy numbers inflated to create a more interesting or even challenging experience, but none of the specific actions you carry out are particularly unhistorical. In addition, there are little touches like ammo belt physics or the realistic speed of sound on Reaper 3-1's guns that add authenticity to the experience.
Reaper 3-1, target destroyed. We are moving
all of these elements, from the micro to the macro, come together to form a particularly historical fiction. The use of real events restructured as fictional plot points reminds me of the Aubrey Maturin series, or more famously the film, Master and Commander. Tricking the enemy with lanterns on a raft is a replication of one of Sir Thomas Cochrane's exploits, and the boarding action at the end of the film in some ways resembles the capture of the El Gamo, again by Thomas Cochrane. The overall concept of chasing an enemy frigate into the Pacific, though, is a reference to the effort to stop the USS Essex from raiding the British whaling fleet there. And Master and Commander has no shortage of historical detail either. The astute viewer might learn many things about the Age of Sail, including the importance of the mizzenmast for upwind sailing, the concept of the weather gauge, the ship's doctor being the only confidant outside the chain of command for an otherwise lonely captain, and even more specific things about how the men ate, slept, and lived. It is fiction, but as such it will reach many more people than the history books ever will. Similarly, Medal of Honor will be played by more people than will ever read the literature on the subject. While it has restructured and fictionalized the events, anybody who does play it will still learn about America's involvement in Afghanistan, about the equipment used and the principles involved. It presents an overly ennobling and certainly one-sided perspective of war, and Voodoo's tomahawk is not removed from his character model when he pulls it out, but the sights, sounds, and themes are still mostly accurate. And the emotional investment created by the fictional story means it will actually be remembered. I've heard it said that writing is sculpture, not painting, that the important thing is not putting thoughts on paper, but knowing how to trim, cut, and reshape them into something more compelling. The way I look at it, Medal of Honor has used history as a first draft, but then extensively revised it into a cleaner, tighter, more condensed narrative.